In this edition of the Author Spotlight, we highlight a new book titled Golden Nuggets: Experiences in the South, written by Dr. James A. Franklin, Sr. In this interview, you will hear his inspiration behind writing this riveting novel, how you can get your own copies, and the powerful meaning behind Golden Nugget. So without further ado, let's get into the spotlight and experiences in the South.
Yeah, we have Dr. James Franklin here today, and he's going to share with us his book, The Golden Nuggets. Dr. Franklin, give us a little bit about your background.
I'm from McCormick, South Carolina, which is a small town near Greenwood, South Carolina. I graduated from Mims High School in McCormick, South Carolina, and I talk about Mims High School in the book because I grew up in all black schools, and I talk about the impact that the community had upon me as a young person growing up, and how important it was for African American boys to have African American teachers and leaders to guide and direct us prior to integration. And that's how it starts. And of course, graduating from high school, I went to South Carolina State College in Orangeburg, which started my whole career as an educator, becoming a teacher after graduation, and of course, eventually getting into some other areas. But I'm proud of how African American men and women guided and directed us as young people growing up in the Old South. And the book talks about a lot of that.
And tell me, what motivates you to write the book? Where did the motivation come from, the heart of it?
This goes back to 2015. I was chairperson of my church's anniversary program. And of course, an idea came to me at that time to get folks to share their experiences about the South and what impacted them. And of course, they submitted to me different ideas and things about what impacted them growing up in the Old South. So that evolved over the years into, hey, why don't I put some of this in a book? Because this is stuff that our children need to know about and to remember. Because in the integrated schools of today, we don't have a lot of African American children who grow up knowing very much about their background and the struggles that we went through back in the day. So I decided that I needed to put that in a book so that we could not forget, and hopefully a book that we could share with our African American boys and girls so they can see the struggles of yesteryear and perhaps may even change their lifestyle for the better.
What we find inside the Golden Nuggets? Exactly what we find in the Golden Nuggets.
Inside the Golden Nuggets, you will find a lot of stories about the Old South. We'll talk about two prominent African American communities, similar in a lot of ways and not so similar in some other ways. But the central core of what occurred in African American communities back in the day in the Old South, where I'm from, was poverty. It talked about what was called Dorn's Alley. Dorn's Alley is the place where I grew up. Dorn's Alley was named after the Dorn owner of that property. And of course, it talks about 11 families who lived in that community. And then it also talks about another community called the Bottoms. The Bottoms was on the other side of the town of McCormick. And of course, it talks about the experiences that those families went through in the Old South. And then of course, there are stories about prominent educators. Dr. Benjamin E. Mays is prominent in the book because Dr. Mays attended a school in what was called the Bottoms for 2 years as he was making his way into education. And of course, ultimately, he left the school in McCormick and of course went back to Epworth, South Carolina, which is where he's from. Then he ultimately went to South Carolina State College to continue his education. This book also talks about Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was the core of what we were all about as we looked at legal issues affecting black children, especially public education. And of course, it talks a lot about what he did as a lawyer, and of course how he led to the case of Brown versus Board of Education, versus Topeka, Kansas. And this book describes a lot of what went on. It reviews that case in almost its entirety, because I want kids to understand the struggles that we went through to get to the point where we could go to school with white kids. The book also talks about a lot of other folks, like astronaut who died in the Challenger accident, who was a fraternity brother of mine. I just happened to be a member of the Omega Psi-Phi fraternity and cooperated. And of course, he was the astronaut, one of the astronauts who was killed in the Challenger tragedy. But the book talks about a meeting we had with him prior to his tragic death. After he had his first flight, he came to our community and met with his fraternity brothers. And there is a program in the book that talks about our experiences and exchanges with Dr. Ronald McNair. And that's a very important story in the book. The book talks about, going back to Dr. Mays. Dr. Mays came to South Carolina State College every Easter to do the Easter sermon when I was in school there. I had the opportunity to introduce Dr. Mays, and of course that story is in the book. There's a picture of Dr. Mays in the book. As a matter of fact, there's a group picture wherein Dr. Bennett C. Turner, who was president of South Carolina State at that time, and his wife are in the picture. Dr. Mays and his wife are in the picture. And there are two students. I'm one of those students, and the other student is a fellow student of mine named Dewey Jeffries. That story is in the book. It shows a lot of those kinds of experiences that I had coming up, wherein prominent people were in my life. And I call myself a foot soldier for Dr. King back then, because when I left Mims High School, went to South Carolina State College, I got involved in the civil rights movement, and of course became one of the marchers for Dr. King. That's why in the book I call myself a foot soldier, as thousands of other kids were foot soldiers for Dr. King. That is in the book. The book talks about how I was arrested and jailed. And of course it talks about how in those days, Orangeburg had what was called the Pink Palace, which was the jail. So they locked us up in the Pink Palace. But as thousands of kids were arrested, the Pink Palace could not hold us. So they put us out on a field behind the Pink Palace. And there were dogs and there were water hoses around the field. Even though it was fenced in, they did not want us to climb the fence or try to break out. So they had those measures there for us. But because of the fact that we overflowed the Orangeburg jail, they brought us here to Columbia and took us to the State Department of Corrections facility. And that's where I spent 7 days in jail there until we were bailed out. So that was pretty traumatic as a young kid from McCormick, South Carolina. And of course, marches are in there where we went to Washington in March. We marched here in Columbia. So we were really involved in marching and demonstrating to let people know that we were not pleased and satisfied with the way we were being treated back in those days by white people. So those are kinds of stories in the book that people will become aware of. It also talks about things that we could perhaps suggest to our African American communities that might improve the conditions, especially of young people. The book describes an organization called the New Farmers of America. That is the organization that had the greatest impact on me as a black child growing up. It was an organization composed of very sophisticated kinds of young men who grew up to be responsible, who learned all kinds of information, business-wise and otherwise. And of course, there was another organization called the New Homemakers of America, which was a counterpart for the New Farmers of America. These were young ladies who back in those days grew up to be distinguished, nice, competent young ladies. And those two organizations worked together to build and strengthen African American youth back in those days. We also had the Distributive Education Clubs of America back then, which helped African American children to learn business and to understand it and to know how to make money and to grow that money in this economy that we live in. So those are a lot of the kinds of stories that in the book. And I think that if educators especially could see how kids, African American kids, were impacted back in those days through these kinds of organizations, because I put a lot of detailed information on how these organizations impacted black kids back in those days to help them to grow up to be responsible kids. All of that is in the book. So hopefully these kinds of things will give some ideas to young people and adults that may impact African American children, so that we could see greater and stronger kids being produced who are going to really face the challenges of tomorrow, as opposed to being involved in activities that are not productive at this time. We're just killing each other and robbing each other and all of that. We're doing too much of that. And there's a lot of information in the book that would suggest how we might look at some other ways to do things that affect African American children, with the hope that they will grow up to be more responsible young people.
Tell me, how can someone get a copy of your book?
The book is on Amazon, so they can go to Amazon and get a copy of the book. But if they want an autographed book, that is a book that I will sign, and they will need to contact me to get that book, and I'll be happy to get that book to them by U.S. mail.
Would you like to share your contact information with us so they can do so?
They could email me at email address j.albert.franklin.sr @gmail.com.
Behind the name, like, why did you choose to name your book?
Okay, Golden Nuggets, the name came from the fact that Dorns Alley and McCormick town proper were places where gold and manganese were mined back in the day. And of course, I lived between two gold mines. I was born and grew up between two gold mines. As a matter of fact, back in those days, we did not have black doctors, so we only had black midwives and white doctors. And you did not go to the white doctor's office to deliver a baby, but white women could go there and deliver babies because there was a small clinic in each white doctor's office. For black women, the doctor would have to come to the house where that person lived to deliver that baby. So Dr. C.H. Workman, a white doctor, delivered my brothers and sisters in Dorns Alley in this antiquated house. So he would come there and, of course, deliver the babies. And the midwives, if needed, were there to assist him. So having been born there in that community, surrounded by gold and magnesium mines, that gave me the idea that why don't I call the book Golden Nuggets, because the nuggets I consider are the experiences that I talk about in the book. Experiences in the Old South. That's the subtopic of the book. So those experiences to me were golden nuggets, and I just transferred the idea that, well, I grew up around gold and magnesium mines, so why not transfer that idea to golden nuggets, which are experiences, things that affected me and other black folks in Dorns Alley of McCormick, South Carolina. So that's where the name came from, Golden Nuggets, bringing it from the fact that the mines were there. That's where I was born. That's where I grew up. And why not piggyback on Golden Nuggets, because these are nuggets of experiences, nuggets of things that I went through that make me the person I am today.
Do you have any upcoming events or book signing scheduled?
I've had 2 book signings thus far. That's kind of hard to do with the pandemic. Book signings are not well attended nowadays. Everybody is a little hesitant about any of those, so I don't have any book signings scheduled at this time. The town of McCormick wants to do one, but they're waiting until the pandemic issues are less than they are now. So that's the only one that is expected in the next few weeks, or whenever I'm called by the McCormick County librarian to do that book signing there. Other than that, that's the only one. We'll welcome any opportunities to do book signings. We don't mind going anywhere to tell our story, because we think it's important and we think it can be of benefit to anyone who's interested in the things that we went through, especially the struggles we went through, and the kinds of things that black kids went through back in those days. Because growing up in Dawn's Alley and in the Bottoms in McCormick, South Carolina, black kids had to work very early. I started work at 10 years old, delivering newspapers from the back of a truck driven by a white person. But all black kids back then were encouraged, especially boys. You had to have a job, and you had to have a job consistently. It wasn't something that you'd go to and work a day or two, something like that. It was a job that you had consistently. So all of the kids were brought up learning how and to understand the importance of the work ethic. That young man, young lady, you got to work. There's no way you can avoid it. This included working around your little house, even though we had dirt yards and no grass. You had to learn how to sweep those yards, and that was usually the little girls, because they'd tie some branches together with a rag, and they'd sweep the dirt yards with those branches. But everybody had a job, girls and boys. Obviously, the girls had more of the inside jobs than the boys, like washing dishes and ironing and all of that. The boys had to go out and find work. Back then, we were very industrious. We would have to go to white people's homes and to ask if there was some work that we could do. We couldn't be bashful back in those days because we were all very, very poor. We didn't know it at the time, but very, very poor. A place where you have people sharing things. Black people shared when they killed a hog, that shared with members of the community. When it was trying to harvest out of your garden, you share that with people in the community. All those kinds of things were done to help us survive back in those days. But the work ethic, and I want to stress that to boys and girls and to adults, that these black kids need to learn how to work to become industrious, responsible people. And like a lot of days, you hear about people having kids to cut the grass and paying them to cut their grass at their own house and paying them to do chores inside the house. That was not heard of back in those days. Everybody had to work, and you didn't get paid for it. No, you didn't get an allowance or anything like that to do the work around your house or to do the work to go out and earn money for your family. All kids learned work and learned it very early. And that is one of the things that helped me along the way, because I've been working all of my life. The black kids in McCormick worked in the peach fields, the cotton fields, shining shoes, worked at service stations. Again, went around the community cutting grass. And you didn't have lawnmowers back in those days. We're talking about cutting grass. You're talking about that old rotary push mower and the sling blade. Those are the kinds of things you use to cut grass, because back in those days, there were no lawnmowers where gas operated or any of those kinds of things. So work did us good, and we appreciate the fact that we were exposed to work at a very early age. And I think kids nowadays could learn from that our black kids need to learn very early the importance of work.